Justice Scalia has spoken about understanding history as he harkens back to 17th century England. The problem with that is the American Revolution separated America from England, starting a new government, Constitutional Convention and all of that stuff. History is important, of course, particularly the history leading to the American Revolution, its new Constitution and Bill of Rights, which includes the Second Amendment. Two issues of the time stand out. The new nation was a slave nation. That meant slavery was essential for building the nation, for creating wealth out of the land's resources, and for capital formation to fund the country. Slave labor could not only be used for creating infrastructure such as roads and bridges, but they also provided the muscle and sweat required for transforming the dirt into a much desired commodity, such as cotton and sugar. Moreover, when slaves were defined as property, they could then be mortgaged and securitized into mortgage-backed securities. This produced a massive transfer of capital from England to the slave-based enterprise known as the United States of America. The second key issue at the time, coming in second to slavery likes on Facebook, focused upon natives. The issue involved killing them and stealing their lands, while facing a backlash from the natives who wanted to kill the invading Europeans. This week, we will explore the first issue involving enslaved labor. Next week, we will take up the issue of the Native Americans. It may also come as a surprise that the founding fathers were not consumed by events in British history. They had more pressing fears of the enslaved people rebelling and killing them, along with fears of the indigenous peoples who harbored deep grievances against them. The slave rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina was prominent on their thoughts. Professor Carl Bogus has written books and journal articles highlighting the importance of the Stono River Rebellion in the crafting of the Second Amendment. A group of 5 white men on their way to Charleston for the South Carolina's new legislative session happened to ride within eyesight of the rebels. Understand, this is the Goose Creek men who were the slave masters who were imported from Barbados into South Carolina in the 1600s. And then they went to they took over the government of South Carolina, and they were introducing very harsh slave conditions, slave management conditions. And so they know about slave rebellions and they are afraid of it. One member of the group was Dr. William Bull, the lieutenant governor of South Carolina, and one of the province's officials most concerned with the potential for slave insurrections. A few weeks earlier, the Assembly had passed the Security Act, which required all white males who were responsible for bearing arms in the militia, 1739, before 1791 when the Second Amendment is written, and Justice Scalia is very confused as to how the word militia got in there. Well, if you go back to 1739 and the Security Act in South Carolina, you might understand it. all able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 60 to take guns and ammunition with them to church on Sundays and on Christmas. While the Security Act would not be formally in effect for 3 more weeks, the planters hardly needed the penalty of a fine to stimulate compliance. This was, after all, exactly the eventuality that they long feared. When Bull arrived at church, therefore, an armed contingent of militia was already there. So the idea that you have to have a militia and that they have to have a right to have a weapon clearly connects to this point in history. And note that the militia operated as the military and police arm of each colony because the colonists did not want to pay for a standing army. And the cheapest way to have a protective edifice was a militia that you only paid when they came out to fight. Now, this from Professor Carol Anderson at Emory University. The most jarring was in 1739. 20 enslaved men, as part of a labor gang, were building roads near the Stono River. Out there, day after day, they surveyed the terrain, the people, the routines, the cache where weapons were stored, and the depth of the personnel on the various shifts. After a while, led by a man named Jemmy, they gathered all the intel they needed. Under the cover of the Sabbath, on Sunday, September 9, they struck. They stormed the storehouse where the weapons were sold, then overpowered and decapitated the 2 clerks, seizing the now unguarded firearms. Drums blazing and banners flying, they called for others to join them in this battle for freedom. And with a force of 90, carved a path of death and destruction through the colony en route, it appears, to Florida, where runaways had long become free as part of an official Spanish policy. Let's have a look at it. Oh, no, you're supposed to resume right where I had you queued up. Okay, we'll get there.
I've spent much of my life searching for the stories of the African American people. Our first notate feeds dreams of freedom and everything.
This is Professor Henry Gates as part of his documentary on the African Americans.
"300 miles north of Fort Mosaic, just outside of Charleston, runs the Stono River. When word of the fort reached this place, it inspired one of the biggest slave revolts in the history of the British colonies. It all started right here, the site of what was once a general store called Hutchinson's. Sunday morning, September 9th, 1739, Hutchinson's store had been looted. Its guns and ammunition had been stolen. 2 shopkeepers lay dead, their severed heads lying on the steps of the store. Plantations on either side of the river were burning. An army was on the move, an African army. They were headed for Fort Mosaic. They set out before dawn, a group of roughly 20 men. Their tactics were simple. They surrounded plantations, then burned them to the ground. The ringleaders came from the Kingdom of Congo, a powerful African state. Some had military training, and they had a plan.
Slaves marched over to Pon Road, which was a road that, if you took it south, it would take you down into Georgia, down into Savannah, and ultimately all the way down to Florida. They were beating drums. Now, the beating of the drums is terribly important because that shows us that they were attempting to draw other Africans into their midst.
By afternoon, the rebel army had grown to nearly 100, and they kept moving south along what today is this highway, which still leads from South Carolina to Florida. But they didn't make it. Just 20 miles outside of Charleston, an armed militia caught up with them in a clearing in these woods. The survivors faced a gruesome fate.
A number of the people who were captured, they'd be beheaded. They would be beheaded by the militiamen, and as was a usual practice during the time period, their severed heads were placed on top of posts along the highway.
So right along here,
Yeah.
we would have seen the heads
Yes.
of these rebels.
Yes, that's right. And that was meant to instill fear and to teach a lesson to all who observe, to try to discourage people from rebelling.
This must have been the planner's worst nightmare.
It was. Absolutely.
Worse than the worst nightmare. They
Yes.
couldn't imagine that these Congo Africans knew anything about guns and ammunition.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Absolutely right. This was the worst insurrection to occur in 18th century British colonial North America.
In the wake of the rebellion, South Carolina imposed harsh new slave laws. They banned drumming and literacy and set drastic punishments on runaways. But no laws ever could force the slaves to accept their fates. Slaves plotted revolts all over the Atlantic world. In Jamaica and Virginia, Barbados and Georgia, even in New York City. Most of them failed. But that didn't stop the slaves from trying. They were always searching for a chance at freedom. And as time passed, freedom seemed to be drawing near.
It was the militia that was instrumental in shutting down the massive Stono Rebellion. Indeed, all the white men, as the law required, had gone to church with their guns, and when the alarm rang, they were prepared to hunt down those who dared to speak of freedom in Spanish Florida. If you have the decision written by Justice Scalia, and you have it electronically, you can do a word search and see if anywhere in his historical research he has anything related to Stono River, anything related to slave rebellions, anything. He completely ignores it. But that was what was on their minds at the time James Madison wrote the Second Amendment, and that was very much on the mind of Patrick Henry, who wanted a militia because he thought, are you crazy? We have to have a militia or we will have Stono River everywhere. And they were aware that slave rebellion, it was all over the colonial world.
An island in the Caribbean. A coded rhythm is a call to arms. The tables are about to turn on slavery. Winner take all.
The revolution in St. John comes before two of the greatest revolutions in the world, the American Revolution and the French Revolution.
In a single night, decades of suffering are avenged.
One, two, three. We're going to get it one way or the other.
The rebel strategy hinges on a weakness festering within the enemy stronghold.
If there was one moment in the history of St. John, it was that moment when that fort was taken.
In one coordinated attack, African slaves get a foothold on freedom in the New World.
These men and women lit a spark that caught fire throughout this area.
But the motives of their leaders are anything but straightforward.
Whoever was not with them were to be enslaved under them.
Emerging from the ashes of a slave revolt is a new view of human bondage and its stranglehold on humanity in the 18th century. In a world consumed by slavery, no one is free and few are innocent. The island of St. John sparkles in the Caribbean sun like a jewel set in blue crystal. 7 miles long and 3 miles wide, it's part of the Virgin Island chain, a necklace of 8 main islands and 75 islands. A U.S. territory since 1917, 3/5 of the island is a national park. St. John's idyllic coves are havens for the well-heeled and world-weary. But underneath the plush towels and designer beach bag, this is a paradise with a past. Flashback to 1733. St. John is rocked by a slave revolt. Leading the rebels are members of African royalty, sold into slavery as well. Among them, 2 chiefs. Danish records identify them only as King June and Prince Acacia. Their campaign is so effective, armed forces from 3 colonial powers are called in for support.
St. John had become the first Black state in the Americas. It was indeed the first Black revolution to occur in America.
Today, the embers of rebellion still smolder and glow in the folkways of the island.
Sorry, I forgot to enlarge that. I want you to understand the reason that I want to show you these is to make salient what were the issues on the minds of the leaders of the colonies at the time. They were terrified of slave rebellions. They were terrified of being attacked by the Native Americans. They weren't thinking about the English Revolution in the 1600s, the Glorious Revolution. That was not their issue. They weren't even thinking about having a weapon to go hunting. That wasn't an issue. This was an issue. And so I want you to see these recreations to make it more real. And it's important to understand that in facing slave rebellions, you could say, okay, we need a leadership that can take up this problem. and the leadership come together and say, we have these people who have an impetus to want to fight for their freedom and kill the people who are taking away their freedom. What can we do about it? Think of it. This is the equivalent of, we have people going into our schoolrooms, slaughtering our children. What can we do about it? The only answer they can come up with here is muscle. The only answer we can come up with for killing our children in school is muscle. We need to arm the teachers. Is there anything else? Do you have any other ideas?
It's been more than 200 years since a group of enslaved Black men and women launched an uprising in modern-day St. John the Baptist Parish, Louisiana. It lasted only a few days before the poorly armed rebels were crushed by a local militia and U.S. Army troops. Many were captured and convicted of insurrection. But now, 2 centuries later, an artist has staged his own version of that fateful event. NewsHour Weekend special correspondent Brian Palmer has the story.
If we could step back in time to January 8th, 1811, to the territory of Orleans, to the porch of a plantation owner named Manuel Andre, we might come across a scene similar to this.
Why are you doing this? Haven't I been a master that treated you with love and understanding? Charles, why?
It's a question only an owner of people could ask of the very people he owned. Andrew wasn't killed that day some 200 years ago, but on this day in 2019, he met a different fate. This performance is part of a reenactment 6 years in the making, a reimagining of what many scholars consider to be the largest slave uprising in American history. So I want to ask you, why? Why do this?
This history needs to be known. The people who led and participated in this revolt of 1811 are heroes. They had this bold vision of getting free the only way they could, not by individually escaping or not by even escaping with a few people and forming a maroon colony, each of which would have been righteous, but actually by overthrowing the system of enslavement.
During the reenactment, we spoke with the organizer, artist Dred Scott, whose adopted name is a nod to the past, a reference to the 19th century enslaved man who took his case for freedom all the way to the Supreme Court. He lost, and so did millions of other Americans when the majority of justice is held in 1857 that a Black person, whether free or enslaved, quote, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. But decades before, a man called Charles Delon had set out to change that.
In 1811, Charles Delons went from plantation to plantation, and he recruited people to be participants in this rebellion. He recruited his lieutenants, and they in turn recruited other people on their plantations.
Under the leadership of Delon, an enslaved plantation overseer, and others, more than 200 men and women rose up against their enslavers. The goal? To make their way 30 miles east to the capital of the territory, New Orleans, seize the city by force, and create a new nation free of slavery. Over a 2-day period this month, hundreds of reenactors, including Scott, traced a route similar to the more than 20 miles covered back in 1811. The original rebels took machetes and muskets from plantations where they had been held in bondage. These 21st century role players wore 19th century costumes and carried those same weapons as they marched along the levees of the Mississippi River, shouting freedom chants in English and Creole.
I talked with a handful of people about participating in this. Some of them were hearing about this rebellion for the first time, but when they heard about it, they're like, we need to make this known, and reenacting it would be amazing. And so they in turn recruited other people. They became sort of the lieutenants in the army of the enslaved and recruited others.
This community engagement included hands-on activities to prepare. There were sewing circles to create costumes and night rehearsals to map out the steps of a battle between the army of the enslaved and the local militia, whose job it was to police African-American bodies. Volunteers came from across the country to participate.
So as you know, we're in these period specific costumes with a mesh of modern jewelry and sneakers. we as performers and anyone who sees us will be forced to question, what does liberation look like for Black folks?
Jordan Rome traveled from Chicago to take part. It was only this summer that she first learned of the historic 1811 rebellion, but she's since found inspiration in this story of resistance.
They were willing to die free. For some of those enslaved folks, simply holding a weapon in their hands was freedom, just because they had no autonomy over their bodies.
The 1811 rebellion didn't result in an independent nation. In fact, many of the men and women who rose up against slavery never made it to New Orleans. They were attacked and killed by US troops and local militia, and those who survived were tried hastily by the very people who had enslaved them. But that's only one part of the story. You're balancing the factual story, which had a very brutal ending, with art.
Yes.
Explain that to me.
This is a project about freedom and emancipation. It's not a project about slavery. It's a project about freedom fighters who had a bold vision of getting free by overthrowing the system of enslavement. And as an artwork, I can say, I don't want to focus on the brutality of white people. Everybody knows that white people were brutal during slavery, if you think about it for a second. But this is a project that actually can focus on the agency and self-determination of enslaved people, Africans and people of African descent, yearning to be free and making a plan to do that.
The largest slave rebellion, the rebellion of 1811, how many people have heard about that? How much of that has been reported in our history? Which, kind of lends itself to Scalia's manipulation of his argument by relating to history back in England and not the actual history of America. It's almost like the history of America must be hidden at all costs. But that's not the only rebellions that are going on.
To begin, it's important to note that the slave rebellions I'll be talking about today are just the more popular ones. There were countless others that will not be mentioned in this video for the sake of time, and because many of the other ones were just poorly recorded for obvious reasons. So let's begin. Contrary to popular belief, our ancestors never just laid down and accepted enslavement. Throughout the long history of slavery, people of African descent fought against it every step of the way. The ways in which they fought and resisted was diverse. Some ran to the mountains and founded sovereign regions. Some took up arms or any weapon they could find or make. And some even decided to take their own life, like in the case of Igbo Landing, where a group of captive Igbo people chose to drown themselves in a creek rather than to submit to slavery. Now, as unsettling as that may sound, they represented a core value in the consciousness of many Afro-descendant people, and their form of resistance was immortalized in African-American folklore. If you watch films about slavery in popular culture, you might get the impression that slavery was pretty straightforward, and slaveholders were in total comfort as their enslaved Africans worked the fields. However, the historical record proves otherwise. Letters and diaries from the American South in the 1800s indicate that slaveholders lived in constant fear of rebellion, and the Haitian Revolution pretty much gave them a heart attack. To repress and control slave rebellion, especially in those places such as South Carolina and the Caribbean Islands, where persons in slavery outnumbered the free, sometimes 10 to 1, Africans were forbidden to meet in groups or to learn to read, and they lived under the constant scrutiny of their overseers. Families were often separated, further increasing their isolation from one another and from white society. Despite all these precautions, however, slave rebellions were just inevitable. In 1800, an African named Gabriel Prosser led the first large-scale revolt of enslaved Africans in the United States. His plan was to create an independent Black state in Virginia, with himself as its head. His plan was to march on Richmond, Virginia at the head of an army of 1,000 followers failed because heavy rains washed out the bridges and flooded the roads that led to the arsenal and powder house. The state militia captured Prosser and 34 of his followers before they could regroup their forces, and all were hanged. In 1811, nearly 500 Africans on a plantation near New Orleans, Louisiana, took up weapons with the intent of marching on New Orleans and freeing all the Africans there. They killed an unrecorded number of people and burned a number of plantations along the way until they were stopped by government troops 10 miles from the city. In 1821, a freedman named Denmark-Vesey began to organize the most extensive slave revolt ever planned in the United States, which was to take place among the enslaved Africans on the plantations in Charleston, South Carolina. By 1822, he and his fellow leaders had gained widespread support in the region. However, the rebels were betrayed from within by a traitor who knew all their plans, and Vesey and his lieutenants were also hanged. I have no doubt that if Denmark-Vesey was successful and had not been betrayed by his own, at the very least, American society for a moment would have come to a complete stop, and at its best, this success would have changed the course of world history. Just imagine a formerly enslaved man defeating an American militia and creating an independent state in the American South, a Black nation in the heart of America. That would have been something. In 1831, Nat Turner led 75 followers in what was to become the only rebellion by Africans in the United States history that did not quickly die out. It took place near Jerusalem, Virginia. 60 whites were killed, including Turner's master and his family. Hundreds of whites fled, and many left the state for good. Turner was captured and hanged, but slaveholders became keenly aware of the anger and resentment Africans had in bondage. Unrest among Africans was not restricted to the southern states, however. An insurrection in New York City in 1712 led to the murder of 9 whites and the execution of 17 enslaved Africans. In 1741, again in New York City, where one of the 5 inhabitants was an African in bondage, a number of conspiracy trials were held as a result of a series of incidents of arson and burglary that led many to believe that an African revolt was imminent. The supposed revolt's leader, called Caesar, and 5 other Africans were hanged. Some historians have compared these trials to the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692. Now, as you can see, all of the rebellions took place pretty close in date to one another, hence the reason why so many slaveholders were always paranoid. Given the history of all these rebellions, and these are just the more popular ones, we quickly realized that slavery was just not sustainable. It would have eventually come to a screeching halt, probably through violence. And all it takes is just one victory to change the course of history. And it was the Haitians who taught us this. Undoubtedly, the greatest and most glorious slave rebellion in human history was the Haitian Revolution that began in 1791. Sometimes we forget that throughout human history, slaves have existed in all corners of the planet from various groups of people. To really understand the greatness of the Haitian Revolution, it must be put in the context of other slave rebellions across the globe. The Haitian Revolution is so special because it was the only successful slave rebellion that led to the formation of a state. No other people on the planet had accomplished this. In other words, Spartacus and his men couldn't accomplish what the Haitians could. Africans in Haiti grossly outnumbered the white slaveholders. An estimated 500,000 Africans worked on the sugar, coffee, indigo, and other plantations in the colony. The slave system in Haiti had the reputation of being the cruelest in the Western Hemisphere. Africans who refused to submit in other colonies were threatened with being sent there. The grotesque white supremacist determination to rob Africans of their humanity led French plantation owners in Haiti to work their enslaved Africans to death, preferring to replace them rather than to improve their living and working conditions as they had done more often in Brazil and in many parts of the Caribbean and North America. Dutty Boukman began the revolution in 1791. Leadership of the revolt in Haiti was soon assumed by the charismatic Toussaint Louverture, and the first leader of an independent Black nation in the Americas was Jean Dessalines. Under Dessalines, Haiti became the first country in the Americas to permanently abolish slavery.
Understand that the the fight for freedom in Haiti was the first successful revolution by Black people. And to this day, Haiti continues to be punished for it. I want to just give one more, well, maybe two more here. Let me try it here. As I say, this this issue with the Second Amendment was fabricated so that it could drive wedges between people in America. And the people who wanted to drive those wedges are people who want to dismantle the American government. At the end of World War II, Americans loved their government, and the people who want to end the American government knew they had to do things to drive wedges. They found issues like the Second Amendment, abortion, religious rights, whatever, until they could find those that would work. And it's taken a long time, but I would suggest they have, you're watching it play out today.
So reduce this very complicated problem to a simple four-letter acronym, which is RAGE. And RAGE stands for Retire All Government Employees. Very simple. Now, the problem with this is, why have we never heard this before? Why has no one ever suggested, let's just get rid of this thing? You have a government in Washington, you're either for it or against it. What is government? A government is just a corporation that runs the country. Nothing more, nothing less. It so happens that our sovereign corporation is very poorly managed, and there's a very simple way to replace that, which is what we do all corporations that failed. We simply delete them. We haven't been able to do that with our government for 2 years. So it's not a little bit stale.
We should delete the US government because it's stale. It has been around for too long. We haven't been able to do that, meaning delete our government for 200 years, so it's gotten a bit stale. It's been around too long. So what would that entail? Deleting the US government?
The other thing about getting rid of your government is you can't just say, well, the limits of the government are the limits of the formal government. You have to say, well, what is the system actually? And it includes a lot of things that are called NGOs, things that are called universities, things that are funded by the state. It's a very, very large system, and it all needs to be destroyed. Fortunately, there's a lot of talented Americans who actually know how to run things and make things work and are generalists. And you can just get these people, put them in a position of responsibility and have them do their thing. And finally, you need a CEO, and a national CEO is what's called a dictator. It's the same thing. There's no difference between a CEO and a dictator. If Americans want to change their government, they have to get over their dictator phobia.
Americans want to change their government, they're going to have to get over their dictator phobia.
Okay, with that, Dave, we can open for discussion.
Please use the raise your hand function, but and Madeline, it looks like Madeline has raised her hand. So Madeline, if you can unmute.
First of all, can you summarize who that last guy was and what he said? Because it was totally echoing and I couldn't hear any of it, and I couldn't see who he was.
Okay.
What are bill talks? Because it was from a bill talk, and I don't know what that is either.
Yeah, neither do I. I will send out the links to that video.
Okay.
Another one that I also had backed up there from a New York Times interview with this guy. His name is Curtis Yarvin, and he was a blogger, a right-wing blogger, and and who J.D. Vance favors and has been an advisor to
Of course he does.
has been an advisor to J.D. Vance. And if you listen to what J.D. Vance says, it echoes what this guy says. And but he's just one voice. There are many just like him out there. The Project 2025 is designed for dismantlement of the American government. So I will send them out with the class summary.
Second
question about Denmark Vesey.
Yeah, wasn't he free at the time?
I don't know if he was a free black or not.
I feel like he was. He had, but anyway.
Yeah.
That's it for me.
Sal, I got a question. When you go on Roe versus Wade, and they did it on the 14th Amendment, it goes around the penumbra, and you're going, okay, the penumbra is sort of, which goes back to Griswold, which is kind of like, there's a penumbra around the Constitution about rights. That seemed a little bit stretched, but they could have done it on the 9th Amendment, which says that any rights the Constitution does not negate doesn't mean you have more rights that's in the Constitution just because you're enumerated. Couldn't the same argument be made that Scalia's just making up crap about England doesn't mean that you have the militia argument that does justify the Second Amendment because there's a reason and he just doesn't tell us the real reason why?
I have attempted to read Alito's decision in Dobbs. And I have to admit, I cannot finish reading it. It hits too many buttons, and I wind up punching my computer screen. If there's any human being near me, it is such. Forget all the other case law in American history. Justice Alito is back into the 16th century. I mean, the key for his decision comes from a witchcraft judge. This is it, but mind you, I showed corpus linguistics last week because if I want to make an argument in support of something, I can go and do research to give me the backup information to fit my investigation. As an investigator, you don't go to find evidence to fit your theory. You go to find evidence to see if it validates your theory or disproves it. So it is, you're not cherry picking information to be able to make your case if you're a legitimate investigator. I mean, I know there are investigators who say, I know this guy did it. Let's go find evidence to prove it. And that to me is one of the most mortal sins ever. I mean, from my world, I would never do that. I may, as I do research, come and find information that contradicts what I think in the beginning. And so I adapt to the information. I don't adapt the information to what I thought. And so what we have are people who, it's like when you were a slave master and you knew what you're doing is horrible, you don't just confront it. You say, I need to come up with something that will say I'm not horrible. So what they do is they say, the Bible said they should be slaves. See, they're not of our species. They're actually polygenesis. They didn't come from, we don't all just come from one Genesis. We were polygenesis. You come up with stuff. You make up crap. And I think one of the keys for people is how do you listen to something and not recognize that's crap. You know, I mean, I still go back to Law and Order and Lenny. You know, Lenny, the detective. He could, I mean, you know, he'd listen to what someone said and it was so ridiculous. He just, you know, and he'd have some comeback that was really funny, but it was like, people, are you serious? I mean, I mean, here we are. I'm sorry, but this class isn't about the Second Amendment. It's about today. It's about how the Second Amendment was used as a tool to bring us to today. And the outrageousness of people organized with a lot of money that were determined to separate Americans from my beloved America. And it just infuriates me. Here we have, there's loads of criticisms about our health system, but there is not a lot of criticism about the scientists who are working on medical health, on world health issues. Yet we now have a candidate to head America's health policies by a guy who has no background. You know, none. I don't know if that answered your question, Dave, in a way. Forgive me, folks. I'm sorry. I get passionate about this stuff from time to time. Or as Nancy would say, what did you say? I would pontificate or
perseverate. I think I said perseverate.
Proselytize.
Oh, proselytize, yeah.
Proselytize.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else have a comment for Sal?
Lauren, you have to use the raise a hand function.
I'm going to use this hand right now. I'm just so interested in, you know, at this point, I've taken several of your classes and I have seen these same events and how they were so instrumental in, I know today we're, you know, focused on the Second Amendment, but really how they shaped the whole course of how we've moved forward in history, and that, you know, it's not just Second Amendment, but it's how our government works and who gets to be in it and all kinds of other things. And I'm just so interested in the overlaps there.
Yeah, look, you know, I mean, many, you know, I mean, I hate listening to me talk, but when I'm out, why I can't be out with people is that some contemporary issue will come up for discussion, and I inevitably go into history and talk about how the role of race and killing Indians is the heart of our history. And people will say, oh, you see race everywhere. You see attacks on the Native Americans everywhere. Well, yes, because everything
they're still going on today.
Everything that was built here was built upon the house of cards that began with slavery and killing Indians. I'm sorry, but it is. And so it surfaces in so many different places. You know, it's hard to avoid. And let me say, as negative as I sound, I really do believe if we accepted what our history really is and addressed it, we could be proud of our country as being big enough, mature enough, honest enough to right wrongs.
That's not happening today.
Yeah.
That is not.
We just ended DEI. Yeah, we get rid of that. We got discrimination in federal employment. No, we're getting rid of that. That's gone.
Yeah, and not only there, but all the corporations are following suit.
Yeah, right. Target got rid of their DEI program. I mean, you know, look, I just think that if we're ever going to survive, we have to get honest. Because, you know, people will say, well, that was in the past. That's back then. Well, no, it isn't, because there are people killing people in schools right now because of all of that. You know, if we don't get serious about it, and mind you, I am open to hear that what I proselytize about is wrong. I mean, I want to, please tell me, someone show me. Don't just say I'm wrong. I mean, I'd like for you to have some evidence to present. But, you know, it's, I would love to be complete. I would love to go to my grave and on my last day say, yeah, I had it all wrong. I would.
Yeah, well, that won't be today.
Well, I think I sort of did. But I'm going to let Cynthia go. I'm going to let Nancy go first.
Okay, well, I was just going to say that this goes back to the fact that we've had generations and generations of people going through whitewashed history in our school systems, all the way back to colonial times. And I don't care whether it was in a progressive city or a kind of backwards countrified area or whatever, it was always way whitewashed. And once I became aware of the fact that Haiti was not the only place that had a slavery rebellion, and the rage of the Native Americans coming from the West, and then the slave rebellions in the East, I never understood why the two groups didn't get together. And well, we'd all be speaking a different language by now, and probably be completely different than what we are now in 2025. So the way it looks now is a lot different from the way it looked as we were all growing up in all of our various school systems, large ones and small ones all over the country. And I don't know whether that was intentional or whether it just happened that we all ended up not hearing anything about any of this.
No, it was intentional. Absolutely was intentional. And you're right. I mean, there's, you know, I find it interesting that I can be with people who, you know, have been educated in law and the Constitution and that. And I'm arguing with them about the heart of the Second Amendment. And it's like, why is it that I'm making the argument? Why aren't you? You should know this stuff a hell of a lot better than me. I mean, because I'm an amateur. I just read history books and I extract, you know, what Carl Bogus and Carol Anderson and Henry Gates have to say and present it. It's none of my argument is from my original research. It's from the research that was done by others. Yeah, no, it's, look, I'm always astonished when I see the Ted Cruzes, the J.D. Vances, the Josh Hollies. These guys all came from the top tier law schools. And I mean, I would love to talk to the leaderships of, you know, Stanford, Yale, Harvard, all of them, and ask them, do you feel that, you know, part of your goal in education is to produce people who can tell the truth? I mean, or have integrity. I mean, is that not a part of the education process? Do you ever hear some of your graduates on the news and say, "Ugh," you know, are you not ashamed of the people you've produced?
Actually, I'm going to let Joy go first because she hasn't said
Because you
anything.
know better. Yeah.
No, you have not made me feel better, Sal. Oops. I'm sorry. I'm trying to leave the house at the same time as I'm talking, so I'm not going to be
Okay, go ahead.
visual. We say we have a meritocracy, and obviously we didn't think that blacks had any brains, so the whites rose in the meritocracy. And now those who are in the elite, the whites with the money, don't give a damn no matter how smart they are. They're just, they're just using their brains to acquire more money. So it's almost a foregone conclusion that if you educate somebody to think that they are in the top tier, and we already know that money and background got you into some of the top schools, then that's what you're going to have.
Yeah.
The problem is that that we don't get the lack of merit and the reasons out to the public. We don't, all they hear, for example, is get extra, and I'm focusing now on the prior class, but get extra benefits with Medicare Advantage. Well, that's just written by, the insurance companies that are making money hand over fist. So why wouldn't they do that? If you cut Medicare and you have these programs work, well, you're really instituting not a meritocracy, you're instituting slavery again, because they won't be able to afford medical care. They won't be able to get into the best schools because they're not legacy. And there's no DEI because DEI under the current administration for sure means whites, discriminate against whites. They cannot conceive that a minority or a woman could be possibly as smart or as good as they are, unless they, of course, pardon my politics, kiss Trump's rear. And I guess my point is, for all of those that scream meritocracy, we have done our best to weed out those who might have merit. I don't know how we can change this. I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. Sorry
No,
for being such a downer.
sadly, I agree with you completely. Yeah. Yeah, I know it's like looking into the abyss. It's yeah. Go ahead, Dave.
Okay. Going back to what I was saying before, and I'm going to preface it by I don't have a gun, never had a gun, don't want a gun, don't see any legitimacy for AR-15s. But what happens, just hypothetically, if Scalia had come and said, hey, we had guns back then because he wanted to keep down slave rebellions, and that's how we wrote the Second Amendment. And, this is what the amendment says, that we have a militia. And, if you guys don't like it, change the amendment, with the new amendment. But until we have this amendment, then you guys get a gun. Would you feel better about that? Because we had the same result.
I think what I would have felt better about was Justice Scalia, actually the court, before it ever took up the case, to say the Second Amendment does not take a stand on an individual right to own or not own a weapon. Since the federal government didn't give that as part of our charge, it's left to the states. Now, the case that they had was a DC case, so they had to take it, right?
Yeah.
But then the decision should have come back to, you know, it's still up to the states, and this state has decided this, and, you know, there's no reason for us to overturn it. But based on the laws of DC, not on the federal level laws. That I just think, because the Second Amendment is really neutral about those issues, it should have been left as neutral. And you know, that would have, I think that would have been a better way to handle it.
And what happens if they took a Ninth Amendment approach that says just because rights are not enumerated in the Constitution doesn't mean people don't have rights?
No, right. I mean, they could do that as well.
Yeah.
But it is, you know, and then you can adjudicate the case at hand.
Yeah.
Because the case at hand was one where Washington, DC, its law was, you know, you can have a weapon, but it's got to be unloaded, locked up, you know, like you had to go through a lot of hoops to get to your weapon. And the idea was, if I have it for self-protection, you know, I need it right away. So you could have adjudicated that question. And you could go, whatever you want to decide. But to make it that the Second Amendment gives a right to everyone to have a weapon, to me, was really over. You know what? Remember, the court was supposed to narrowly decide things, not, you know, but in this case, it was, you know, a very broad, sweeping decision.
Yeah, it's 12:03. Does anybody else have anything?
What's coming up next week?
Next week, we will take up the second part of the problem, which is the Native Americans. That's another big issue on their mind. I mean, you know, to say, and you know, he prides himself on how he brought historical research to the court, and his historical research is junk. I mean, this would be an F with any legitimate history class if you said, tell me the history around the Second Amendment, and you totally skip everything that's going on with the people at the time who were dealing with the Second Amendment. You know, you'd have to, and you say, no, I want to go back into the 9th century and talk about what things were like. You know, it's just, you know, so the big issues: controlling slaves from rebelling, fighting Indians, and defending against Indians who are out to kill the white people who have invaded their lands. Those are big issues. So next week we'll look at the Native American side.
Yeah. If people can unmute and give Sal warm applause for another
depressing class.
Another depressing moment.
This is
Thank you. It is depressing, but it's information that we need to remember.
Yeah.